This is SG2 Perspectives, a conversation with SG2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we all expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery.
If you're in a market where physicians, especially in orthopedics and joint replacement, where they're aggressively going after this business, they're working with employers, they're working with payers, this can move fast. This can be a 20% change in 1 year.
Today, I get to pick the brains of two fantastic colleagues, Lisa Slama, who leads our ambulatory planning research and the development of our 10-year forecasting model, and Amanda Olderog, who leads our orthopedics and surgery research, which means she gets to spend a lot of time talking to and working with ambulatory surgery center leaders. Today, we're going to talk about a publication that they created called Procedure Sites of the Future. And Lisa, why do we choose to tackle this topic now?
So, we've recently wrapped up some work that we've done really analyzing where future growth was going to be in terms of procedures for hospitals. A lot of revenue traditionally has gone into inpatient surgery. This has been a big driver of growth historically. But we've seen the exodus of a lot of procedures from the inpatient setting to the outpatient setting. And a lot of organizations have seen this. In fact, as we look at our data, over 85% of procedures today happen on the outpatient setting already. The question that we wanted to tackle and what we kept getting from our SG2 members was, okay, I get that procedures have shifted outpatient, but where on the outpatient side can we expect to see the growth? Right? There's many places, many sites that procedures can happen. They can happen in the outpatient department of the hospital, so still within the walls of the hospital, but you leave same day. But more and more growth and more movement in places like ambulatory surgery centers, off campus from the hospital, sometimes affiliated, sometimes not with the hospital, that is seeing a lot of growth and development. So what we wanted to do was start to think about what was shifting, what had the potential to shift out of the hospital into these sites over the next 10 years, and what were going to be the drivers ultimately at a market level that would impact not only the timing of the shift, but how much volume they could expect of these procedures.
Yeah, Lisa, this is really one of the hottest topics when I'm talking with orthopedics or surgery leadership, because obviously there's a lot of money associated with these procedures. Typically, what you do see shifting in those markets, which we'll get to in a little bit, some of those elements that come into play when you're talking about what really makes the environment perfect for cases to shift rapidly. When we talk about what are those cases that are shifting, in order for you to go off-site, we are really looking at a bit of a different patient population. And so this kind of gets into that divide between what is going to stay in the hospital, even if as being billed as an outpatient. So your more complex patients, those patients with multiple comorbidities, and those patients that really just need a little bit more of the intensity of their care compared to the healthier patient that many times is able to go to the ambulatory surgery center or even into the physician office for a procedure that's done. Typically with the less complex patient, you're going to have a more profitable margin. You don't have as many resources. Often younger patients are falling into that category, so you have more of a commercial patient base. So at the end of the day, this is why there's such an alarm. And ultimately what the result is it is changing the relationship between the once somewhat of a distant cousin to more of a partner in terms of, we really need to be in this game together to plan care across all of our sites of care. I see such amazing variation among our members of what are those things that really create that environment. And certainly one of those is the status of the physician, if they're employed or if they're independent. With the research that you've done, talk a little bit about what your findings have been.
Yeah, so I think, just so everyone's aware, so the ambulatory surgery centers, these come in all different shapes and sizes and flavors, right? Some of them are wholly owned by independent physicians. Some of them kind of have partnerships with management companies. Some of them are wholly owned by hospitals, and then most of them are probably just a mix of kind of those three entities. And I think as we think about the drivers that are shifting some of these volumes to these different sites, that becomes part of the driver as well, right? If we see ambulatory surgery centers owned by physicians, then they have a strong, oftentimes financial incentive to pull volume into these centers. So depending on the makeup and the availability in terms of ownership and specialty, that can be a major, major driver, kind of the level of kind of physician participation. We see that probably as the biggest driver.
Well, and when we look also at, and the publication really does a nice job of this, is kind of breaking out what we call the drivers by specialty. We see that specialties tend to have a bit of a profile related to them. And so if we take orthopedics for an example, which right now is huge news as we are seeing this dramatic shift from knee replacement being removed from the inpatient only list and now being proposed for the ASC payable list, and then also taking hips, adding that whole migration track as well. There's a lot of discussion on whether or not CMS is going to incorporate ASC payment into their bundled payment for care improvement advanced methodology. All of these things are creating that, what we call like the perfect migration storm, to bring those cases into the ambulatory setting, either outpatient in the hospital or into the ASC. And orthopedics tends to be a more independent specialty compared to other specialties that are perhaps employed or have a different type of procedure mix that really requires more presence in the hospital setting. So when you look at that, you have an independent group, they have ownership, they are really perfecting their trade and increasing the ability to take more complex cases into the ambulatory setting. All of these things combined, depending upon what the state environment is for certificate of need requirements and other types of regulatory and policy conditions, you also see this push from payers that are saying, we want to get those cases that are ASC appropriate moved from the hospital to the ASC because of the price differential. And that's really the primary driver. So it's this culmination of effects that you see in orthopedics that maybe you don't see as much in other specialties like cardiology.
Yeah, great point. So cardiology tends to be a little slower. We predict a slower shift from the hospital, especially as we look at things like diagnostic cath, although they're payable in other sites. The reality is you got physicians who might not feel comfortable taking these cases off the hospital campus. They might have a caseload where they're doing a lot of inpatient cases anyway. And so to split their time between sites just isn't convenient for them. But in other cases, kind of on the opposite end, we see an emergence and we predict some women's health services will begin to shift away from the hospital as we see more subspecialization. So for example, a lot of markets are seeing growth in areas like minimally invasive gynecology. So there's not necessarily OBGYNs, there's OBs who stay close to the hospital and deliver babies, and then there's the gynecologist. Guess what? If they're not delivering babies and they're doing a lot of minimally invasive work, they are now candidates for moving a lot of their work off campus.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely one of the most interesting parts of the work that we do at SG2 is as we're looking at all of this innovation that is happening in healthcare, and we see these pockets where it may not be a shift, it may be a jump. Like you're jumping directly from the hospital all the way to the physician office. So a lot of changes coming up here. So if we look at how do we use data, how do we understand the specifics of a market, how do we go in and advise our membership, where's the first place that we start?
Obviously, there's a lot of different drivers by service line, by physician employment, alignment arrangements, and of course, market-specific dynamics. But nationally, what are we seeing that's definitely going to stay in the hospital? What can and what have we seen coming out? And probably, what are the impacts on hospital and health system revenues as volumes start to shift?
Yeah, that's the big question. So I'll take the first one first, and then maybe we can go into the revenue piece of it. So as we looked at our data, we looked at procedures across all the different service lines. And as I mentioned, 80+% of procedures are already outpatient. And that's the GI, dermatology. There's plenty that's the hospital itself doesn't see within their acute campus that has shifted. Then there's the stuff that we think is going to stay firmly planted on the inpatient side over the next 10 years, right? These are going to be the really complex patients, a lot of the geriatric population, trauma, neurosciences, obviously OB. So that is stuff that is going to need the resources and the support of an acute care center. We don't see that shifting off. But then there's that kind of middle ground category where there's plenty of volume on the inpatient side today, but just based on kind of low length of stay, based on some clinical advancements that could kind of enable surgery outside the hospital, this is what we get questions on. This is kind of the $1 million question we get. What are those? In the general surgery side, we have our eye on hernia repair, on appendectomy, on chole, especially as we see general surgeons who might find themselves in a position where they have enough volume to take those not acute cases away from the hospital. I mentioned women's health, right? This is a big one that's not only shifting from the hospital outpatient department when we think of hysterectomy, when we think of endometrial ablation, when we think of a lot of benign gyne conditions, not only coming out of the hospital outpatient department, but potentially leaving the ASC, right? Going right to the physician office setting. Cardiovascular, we're in some markets we're seeing movement, but as I mentioned, this is one where physicians are really kind of putting the brakes on the pace of this movement, just really based on their clinical comfortability. And then ortho, I'll let you take this one, but ortho is one where probably we get our most questions when it comes to kind of future shift.
I've spent some time looking at the makeup of the ambulatory surgery procedures that are performed today. And if you look at the 2019 MedPAC report, it reports that 21% of ASCs are single specialty ophthalmology ASCs. 21%, an additional 21%, are single specialty GI. So that's 42% of all ASC volume is related to those two specialties, which have been in that outpatient setting for a really long time. Now, I will add that we're going to see, because of the aging population, we're going to see pretty dramatic growth in both of those specialties. But it's this other piece, the orthopedics, where we're not just growing because of the population. We're adding in more procedures that can be done and that are eligible to be done in that setting. So everything that, if the hospitals and our health system members kind of reflect back on what the world was like when GI and scopes and things like that were in the hospital setting, and then they very swiftly departed, it was a tremendous financial hit. And I can just share from my own personal experience as somebody who managed an endoscopy suite at a hospital setting, that it's not only financial, but it's operationally very, very difficult if you have to maintain very high level competencies with your staff, but yet you don't have the volume and you're only getting in things like GI bleeds and like obstructions and technically difficult procedures like an ERCP and things like that. So the implications for this whole thing are huge. Orthopedics, general surgery, cardiovascular are three basic services that every hospital, regardless of what type of care you're providing, you have to have those services. And so needing to maintain some level of, one, profitability, but second, competency and availability of your staffing is critical. So right now, if we want to talk about what is the financial impact, if you just look at orthopedics, again, and the reason why we picked that is because it's the one that's shifting the most dramatically. And we've seen markets where it's been literally overnight, where the physicians have had these relationships now directly with payers to create these gain sharing type of bundle payment arrangements or population health arrangements that really incentivize the physicians to bring those cases to a lower cost setting. We've seen that shift overnight. So the difference is if you are in the hospital setting, inpatient-wise, and I'm going to give some roundabout numbers based upon the 2020 proposed numbers. So you get maybe a little over $12,000 for inpatient, for the knee replacement. For outpatient in the hospital setting, you get about $1,000 less than that. If you jump to the ASC, and now this is proposed, and this is where the tricky part comes in. The proposed right now is around $8,600. Now, a lot of ASCs say, okay, is that even really realistic? Well, okay, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe it depends on what your implant contracts are, things like that. One, you can see the difference financially, but if you're from the hospital's perspective, once you get down to that $8,600, you likely don't own that whole ASC. So you're only getting a piece of that. And then from there, it is like, what's the contribution margin related to that? And it's also, what are all the rest of the cases that now that the doctor doesn't have to come to your facility so frequently that are also migrating along with it? So it's much bigger than just the procedure itself. So those are some examples. I will add to, at SG2, we fully anticipate, we already know what's going on, these agreements that incorporate either commercial direct to employer or bundled payment type of arrangements that allow for a little bit of a workaround to the CMS payment barrier, so to speak. So like if I can't make it work with 8,600, but I have a Medicare Advantage contract and I can get a gain sharing arrangement that gives me that bonus between, okay, I lowered the cost and now I get to share in the savings with that, then that's additional money back to me. So there's lots of factors going on that are going to impact all parties financially. It's definitely a shift of power.
So give me a couple market level stories. We have clients in markets across the country. I've seen both of you present data that show some markets that have already shifted, a huge percent of particularly orthopedics. Give me some stories of how markets have responded and what those factors are that we look at the market level to understand when that tipping point might happen in the future.
I always tell people kind of follow the dollar and see, where is the ownership? So who owns what? So do you have independent physicians? Do you have physicians who are maybe not allowed to have any type of ASC ownership because of their employment status or their academic affiliation? You may find that those organizations are shifting more slowly. I'm going to give you one of our examples that we shared with an organization, it was an academic organization, and it had community partnerships. And this organization came to us and they said, okay, we're really not seeing this shift to outpatient. And so we actually worked with them. We worked with our partners, Vizient as well, because they were part of the academic relationships. And we had access to what their clinical profile looked like. And this is really a great place to start when you're looking at what is my risk? What are things going to happen with my market, with my organization?
I can tell you really had fun with this project.
We did have fun with it. I mean, we kind of geek out on this stuff, right? Like we like to look at the data and try to like look under the hood and see what's going on. So what we found is that for their main academic teaching campus, it was very trauma focused. And even in comparison to other academic organizations, it was proportionally higher in terms of their trauma patients and their complexity. So it was no wonder that they weren't seeing a lot of shift to outpatient. They were taking care of very complex patients. Now flip that in comparison to their other community-affiliated hospitals that were primed and ready to go. We were looking at, shorter length of stay. We were looking at a market that has access to the ambulatory surgery centers. These are the areas that are going to go. In our very competitive markets like Chicago, Denver, we definitely see a lot of this movement. But then if we look at other areas, say if there's a lot of physician hospital ownership or perhaps just kind of a different clinical profile, a lot of our southern states that often have a more like higher obesity, a little more demographically challenging patient profile, tend to see that they're not shifting as rapidly into the outpatient space. So it is absolutely very market specific.
I think, Amanda, you gave great detail, but kind of just to summarize, the reality is you're not getting paid as well. When you just do a financial kind of pro forma, it doesn't look great, right? When you shift down to these less acute sites, you're going to get more on the inpatient side. You're going to get, more in the hospital outpatient department than you are in the ambulatory surgery center. But if you're in a market where physicians, especially in orthopedics and joint replacement, where they're aggressively going after this business, they're working with employers, they're working with payers, as you mentioned, the bundles. This can move fast. This isn't necessarily a gradual, you can see 1 percentage point a year kind of shift from inpatient to outpatient. This can be a 20% change in 1 year. So our message has been, yes, the financial impact isn't always very rosy, but some margin and collecting some of these patients on the outpatient basis is better than no margin, right? If you lose it all. And do you want to risk kind of being too late to the game just because you were trying to get into this so slowly and maximize your inpatient revenue? We've seen organizations move too slow and lose it all. But we certainly understand, and that's the pushback I get from CFOs at hospitals, is why on earth would I actively move this volume to a less reimbursed site, especially if I don't really have the efficiencies to make it work from a margin perspective?
I could not agree with you more, Lisa. This is one of those things that as we're talking with organizations, and we see this a lot with academic organizations as well, because academic organizations have an even broader mission to provide the teaching and learning environment. And so they have additional inefficiencies sometimes built into their model because of the fact that they are helping to educate the future of healthcare leaders and physicians and providers. And so one of the things that is very difficult is making the numbers work. A lot of interest right now in terms of how do we create a comprehensive center? How do we have all of the services co-located to provide ambulatory care? We're seeing a lot of these ambulatory centers being stood up, or, maybe a kind of an umbrella wrapped around them to say, this is where you go for your efficient care. We're going to take care of your needs. We're going to give you really good access to urgent needs, your virtual health, just kind of providing more of a consumer-centric offering, which really is the name of the game at the end of the day. This is what we are in this business for. We're in the business to drive value for our patients. But sometimes it's hard to do that, balancing your mission and the care that sometimes is not as profitable.
Right.
And so this is a challenge. It's more of it's time to change that frame of reference and look at how do we provide care collaboratively? How do we get the patient to the right setting of care for the conditions that the patient has? And this is a new partnership.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any feedback from consumers on all this? So if you're like me, when I talk to an aunt or uncle or someone who has a knee or hip replacement, I always try to ask them, did you have it outpatient? Were you only there for maybe one night and then go? And usually they can't answer the question. It's like, is it at a surgery center? They're like, I don't know. It was part of Mayo Clinic. What are we hearing from consumers on this topic? Do they say, I feel better in the hospital? Do patients understand that it's going to cost less in an ASC yet?
I think the transparency is growing in terms of what patients kind of realize. And I think payers are doing a better and better job and physicians as well, of displaying those differences beforehand. From what I've heard, I'll let you chime in too, Amanda, the efficiencies, the ease of parking, the consumer-centric environment that an ambulatory center could provide is much more pleasing than dealing with the complicated infrastructure of a hospital. Everything about it just seems to be a more patient-friendly environment. I think gone are the days where, the assumption is clinically it's going to be better in the hospital. Kind of the quality stuff is table stakes, in my opinion.
I think this is one of the things that is very confusing for patients. In general, what we still find to be true is that patients will follow where the physician is directing them to go receive their care. You're going in to have a colonoscopy for your screening. That's something that the patient's not typically, in many cases, asking, are you doing this in the hospital or are you doing this in the ASC? Now, I will tell you that payers, including CMS and all of the commercial payers, are working so hard to educate and use this term called consumer engagement. We want to engage you in the fact that you're taking on more and more percentage as a consumer for the cost of your care. So we want you to be active in how you select where that is and participate in that decision. The research has shown that it's just not happening yet. And it's really that the patient is following. Now, for cataract surgery, 78% of cataract surgery is already done in the ASC. It's normal. It's completely expected that you're going in. From the experience standpoint, yes, it is better, but I think it's just maybe the situation where that patient doesn't necessarily know any different. Yeah. Now, if you're doing something new, like a joint replacement where it's not normal, and maybe it's a little bit less common in the market, that's when the physician scripting really does come into play, and talking about the differences and here's the experience that you'll get and all of that. So as somebody who used to work in the hospital, one of the areas that, and I know we don't really talk about it a lot today, we're not spending a lot of time focusing on it, but it is pediatrics. So similar to cardiology, if there are certain procedures that you're worried about needing to have additional resources like ICU capabilities, like anesthesia rescue, those types of things, you will find a little bit more of an educated population that's working with those patients. They really do want to know what's this experience going to be like for my child who's having this procedure done or something like that. So at the end of the day, the ASC experience scores are phenomenal. And that's why we really are seeing a lot of hospitals focus attention, even for their outpatients, on kind of an ambulatory-like experience.
Great point.
Are you hearing that folks working in hospitals today are nervous that beds are going to be empty if so much continues to shift to both outpatient and surgery centers?
Well, that's a good question. I think it is something to be mindful of, this idea of, well, what are you going to backfill your hospitals with? Some organizations are at capacity, so this is a welcomed strategy, the idea that they can decant some of this low acuity volume so that they have space for their higher acuity patients. But the reality is, as we see this shift, organizations also need to think about their backfill strategy on the inpatient side. Really, what are they going to go after? Are they going to try to pull in market share from competitors? Do they need to hire the right type of workforce and surgeons to make sure that they get that volume? We know organizations that have shifted a lot of joint volume outpatient, but then they're looking to recruit revision specialists because a lot of that orthopedic volume is on the inpatient side. So that is an important balancing act that organizations need to think about if they want to retain or even grow their inpatient surgery volumes.
This has been a great conversation. Thanks. All right, Lisa, put a bow on it for us. What are maybe the 2 or 3 big takeaways from the publication, from what you've learned, and what from the questions you're hearing from clients the most?
I think at the end of the day, the shift to outpatient has happened, as we've mentioned, from a procedure perspective. Where it's going to hit on the outpatient side, whether it be in the hospital outpatient, the ASCs, physician offices, will depend on the market you're in, right? There's all sorts of different drivers. You can kind of see the publication we did on Procedure Sites of the Future for more detail there. Being able to kind of quantify those factors to get a better feel for when this will hit your market and how big of a hit it will be really important for long-term financial sustainability. We really recommend taking a long, hard look at what some of these vulnerable volumes could be, and then creating strategies, whether it be alignment with physicians, whether it be building something new, or maybe rethinking some existing facilities to be able to capture this volume. Consumers are going to demand it, payers are going to demand it, and it's the way that you can help create kind of a value-based offering in your market, ultimately to start to dampen the cost curve that we see in healthcare.
We've seen a lot of this, whether it's hype or reality, this interest in private equity investment in ambulatory surgery centers via the physician practice arrangement, whether that be GI, ophthalmology, orthopedics, what have you. Make sure that you understand that people are talking to your physicians, and you need to understand what those conversations are. SG2 can certainly help with that. We stay very close with what those conversations and those arrangements are that are being put together. But then additionally, consider also the payment methodologies and the alternative payment methodologies. The name of the game is value. There's lots of ways that you get at that. There's ways that you can prove value through bundled payment arrangements. Again, another area of expertise for SG2 that we have worked and seen tremendous multi-stakeholder value come through these types of arrangements. And it's not going away. This is definitely the future, is finding those ways to have those strategies where you're kind of linking in the partnerships and really providing the best care for the patient.
Lisa and Amanda, thanks so much. Look forward to having you on SG2 Perspectives again soon.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today for this episode of SG2 Perspectives, where SG2 experts and industry thought leaders explore the drivers of tomorrow's healthcare strategies to inform today's decision makers. I've been your host, Trevor Durin. Contact us anytime by sending an email to sg2perspectives@sg2.com. SG2 revolutionized demand forecasting with the Impact of Change forecast in 2001, and today we're the healthcare industry's premier strategy advisory firm. To learn more, visit sg2.com. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you again soon.